Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Oktavelia. The pursuit of a longer, healthier life often involves disease prevention. One way that we can use to help enhance our well-being across our lifespan is vaccination. So we have Professor and researcher Dr. Rajib Dasgupta, and together we'll learn the science of preventing disease and enhancing our well-being holistically. Dr. Rajib Dasgupta is currently professor and chairperson of the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has published national and international journals and is currently the managing editor of the Indian Journal of Public Health. So, hi, Dr. Rajib. Rajib, thanks for joining us in the show.
Hello, Sabrina. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I look forward to an engaging conversation on this very important topic.
Wonderful. And before we begin, could you tell us a little bit more about the latest vaccines that we should be aware of?
There are, as far as the elderly go, and as far as vaccines contribute to a more disease-free life, there are several vaccines for the elderly that are recommended. This is in addition to, of course, the childhood vaccines, which really dominates the discourse on vaccines. But as societies are growing older, not just in the West, but also in East Asia, Southeast Asia, vaccines for the elderly are increasingly becoming an important, not just talking point, but also bringing it into the day-to-day health services.
Yeah, because for a long time, vaccines are thought to be for children to adolescents. So, what types of vaccines should elderlies be taking as soon as possible?
A number of vaccines are actually available in the market today. But there's a broad consensus, and by broad consensus, I mean across countries, though it may not necessarily be part of a structured program. But 5 vaccines are really, there's a consensus of being recommended for adults aged 65 or older. And the reason we have this age cutoff is because risks to certain diseases are actually higher for this age group, 65 years and beyond. And also because not just they occur more, which is a somewhat different reason, we'll come to that, but more importantly, or in a more immediate sense, because it's more difficult to manage and treat these infections in the elderly, since their immune systems are relatively weaker. There are also other comorbidities, other chronic diseases such as, say, kidney diseases or high blood pressure or diabetes and so on, or even multiple diseases. So the 5 vaccines on which there is a consensus, the first is the influenza or the flu vaccine, a pneumonia vaccine, a shingles vaccine, often a combination of tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis called the Tdap vaccine, and the respiratory syncytial virus. So these are the 5 vaccines on which there's a broad consensus. However, depending on the country that you are in, there may be a government finance program, or this may be provided for by the insurance companies, or you may simply be spending out of your pocket. So, depending on the country or the region where you're located, the mechanisms of accessing and financing could somewhat vary.
I see. Thank you for the insight. And I'm actually quite curious on the influenza and the DDaC and the tetanus vaccines, because what I know is that children's and adolescents also take those vaccines as well. So should we be taking those vaccines regularly, or is it something that we need to wait until a later age?
Yeah. So, the tetanus diphtheria pertussis is typically associated with babies, with younger
Mm-mm.
children, including a booster recommended every 5 years.
Ah.
Uh, However, as far as the elderly goes, the Tdap is recommended if you haven't received a tetanus shot in the last 10 years. And this vaccine has greater than 95% efficacy in preventing tetanus and diphtheria, and 70% effective in preventing pertussis.
Mm.
What really happens in the elderly uh, is that these infections often come back as the immune system wanes, and some of the immunological memory is gone. But as I said, that this depends a lot on what your country's regulations and recommendations are. This is just a broad consensus across many countries. But if you're really in a country which is not so well endowed in terms of health services or financing, uh, these may not necessarily hold for you.
I see. So it can be important for adults to be taking these vaccines early on, but it is recommended for adults age 65 plus to retake all these vaccines. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I see. And before we go any further into the topic of vaccines, we'd love to get to know you better. And here's a segment called Have You Met Rajib? So, Rajib, what is your favorite book?
Um, I really enjoy reading mysteries and detective thrillers, and certainly my favorite author is Agatha Christie. There's not much originality in
Yeah.
that, I'm afraid, but she does remain immensely popular across the globe.
Yeah, and of all ages as well. And what movie have you enjoyed recently?
Um, One movie I enjoyed recently, I watched in Netflix actually. Uh, it's 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 not really a more recent movie. It's called
Mm-hmm.
Mona Lisa Smile. Um,
Oh.
if you have watched it, it's about the protagonist is a young woman academic. The movie is set in the 1950s in one of the American U.S. girls' colleges, and it's really about the lives and aspirations of women
Mm.
transforming, and the role that this young professor and academic, and who is seen as a rebel, has in the society of that setting.
Sounds rather empowering. And are you listening to any podcasts at the moment, Reggie?
I'm sorry, I'm afraid the answer is no. I'm not really, much as I would like to. I'm not really a listener of podcasts, though many of my younger colleagues and friends are. I guess I'm missing something by not listening to podcasts. But since we are discussing the elderly, maybe as I grow older, I'll find more time. Who knows?
Yeah, it's a wonderful way of getting new informations for people who don't really have time to read books. And do you have a role model, Reggie?
Well, I am not quite sure. The answer to that is yes. But I do read a whole host of newspapers and news websites, and I believe that, and in fact, I do try to look for it, that many individuals, whether they're political leaders or lives of common men and women being reported upon, everyone perhaps has some bits to learn from rather than one very larger than life idol or role model.
Mm, I see. That's wonderful. A lot of people being your role model. And is there a course that has inspired you?
Is there, sorry?
A course. Is there a course that has inspired you?
A course that has inspired me. Okay. I think I sort of bumped into this discipline of public health somewhat uh, accidental. I wasn't really sure I wanted to do this. But once I came to this university as a student, where I am a teacher now, uh, the whole pedagogy of public health and the university really inspired me to enjoy learning, and I'm really glad and I'm really happy that I've taken up this profession. I thoroughly enjoy it, and I think given a second chance, I would do this again.
Public health, and that's the perfect segue to my next question, which is how would you define longevity as you have dabbled with public health?
Actually, there are a few linked terms which are often used interchangeably,
Mm-hmm.
and it's important to have a clarity regarding these definitions. So, one of the common terms that we hear is life expectancy, and it's
Yeah.
there that it's rooted. I mean, the whole discourse is rooted. So, simply put, life expectancy is the amount of time a person is expected to live based on the year they were born, their current age, and various demographic factors that shape life expectancy, including gender. Gender is a very important one.
Mm.
However, it's really a statistically defined average number of years, and it's really a probability, so to speak. So,
Mm.
simply put, is the average lifespan of a population, and depending historically at which point you're born, your life expectancy can be expected to vary a bit. Longevity, however, describes the ability to live a long life beyond the species specific average age at death. So
Ah.
that's the lifespan, and the lifespan for humans can be a very very long range. So at the very extreme, you have 100 plus years, even
Mm-hmm.
120 122 years of age recorded. So the lifespan itself is a very wide range.
Indeed.
But longevity is really the ability to live a long life, but a new term that's increasingly coming to use, and probably that's what all of us aim to, is really the term health span,
Health
which
span.
describes the period of time during which a person is healthy within his or her lifespan. So the health span is really nested within the lifespan, and the effort of whether as a societal goal or as a medical technological goal is really to expand this health span so that one is actually able to lead a healthier or relatively healthy life within one's lifespan.
Health span. I'd like to go back to that in a second, but before I ask that question, how would you define vaccines?
Vaccines are immunobiological products that accord specific protection to an infection or disease. So, vaccine essentially, therefore, is, to put it loosely, a factory manufactured product.
Mm.
And it's equally true for human vaccines and animal vaccines, which is also a very big and very important world.
I see.
But vaccines, as a medical technology, as a health technology,
Mm-hmm.
uh, vaccines really have been one of the most significant interventions in preventing deaths, in prolonging life. However, vaccines do come with costs in terms
Mm,
of being able to access it, in terms of health systems being able to provide it. So vaccines also come with a lot of mandates that the state or the health system uh, derives from. Yet the fact is that vaccines are a very exciting technology, and it's a very promising technology, and the effort or the quest of the medical research, biological research world, is to find more and more vaccines. Now, there's the way we can talk about it later. Irrespective of how many vaccines you develop, there is always a journey or a process between development and deployment. And 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 while there may be immense optimism around developing a vaccine, actual deployment into the health system is often a more arduous task or journey.
indeed, indeed. And how would you define the relationship between the vaccines that helps humanity and helps the health span, as you mentioned, and with longevity?
As far as preventing early childhood deaths go, which historically have been very high, uh, vaccines have had a very critical role to play. However, it's not the only technology or only intervention that's worked. There have been a number of other interventions that's been crucial to preventing early deaths, whether as a neonate, which is the first 4 weeks, or in infancy, which is the first 12 months, or even among relatively older children, anything up to 5 years or so.
I see.
So vaccines have historically played a role in preventing these deaths, and therefore overall contributing to a much longer life expectancy. However, at the same time, the reality check is that it's not just medical or health technologies alone that improve quality of life or prevent deaths. It's a much larger range of socioeconomic determinants, which we broadly call the social determinants of health. But within the technology segment, vaccines certainly are a very important piece of technology.
Mm,
Vaccines also vary a lot depending on its type, depending on how you administer it, and so on and so forth. It's a pretty complex world,
mm-hmm.
and there are, and uh, multiple specializations are really needed to develop a vaccine, to adopt a vaccine, to deploy a vaccine.
I see. We have touched a bit and fragments about how it has helped with the infancy's lifespan and in the future, and what we were aiming is the health span of the elderly. So how have vaccines historically contributed to increased human life expectancy and well-being in general?
So vaccines have really transformed the health scenario in the sense that what were known as uh, very common and major killers, such as smallpox, such as to a certain extent tuberculosis, or more specific childhood killers such as measles, such as say rotavirus, which causes very severe diarrhea, an acute diarrheal disease. So many of these infections, to which we actually otherwise do not have specific cure. So rotavirus diarrhea doesn't really have a specific antiviral like an antibiotic that would treat a child. It's an extremely severe form of diarrhea, and the child may not may child does get into dehydration and collapse pretty fast if left untreated. Of course, rehydration, etc., is supportive, but there is no specific treatment in the sense that we have antibiotics for some disease. So, in contexts such as these, vaccines are absolute game changers, and that prolongs the life of not just an individual, but in a societal sense or the population level, it certainly increases the lifespan. Um, what's really the contemporary challenge is that as societies are getting older, as there's a demographic shift to a far higher proportion of the elderly, as overall lifespan and life expectancy has increased, the question is how much can vaccines contribute to a relatively disease-free elderly life, which is the health span, and more importantly, uh, minimize uh, infections with a very high potential of complication and death in the elderly, because they are also relatively more difficult to treat, and it certainly add to costs of all kinds.
I see. So it actually helps with prolonging the health span of elderly as we are moving forward. And are there researchers that are going there that we haven't really heard about?
Yes, of course, and as I said, that there is a broad consensus across countries on vaccines. Uh, many countries or many health providers would recommend a certain sets of vaccines, and increasingly this basket of vaccines is increasing. Now, COVID, for example,
Yes,
the COVID vaccine is the most recent example, and perhaps the one that's been really administered on the widest scale across the globe. I mean, the whole story of COVID-19 vaccination is an extremely fascinating story.
indeed.
It's nothing like what the other vaccines or what the other adult vaccines have been. But say, for example, the influenza vaccine, which in many countries it's mandatorily recommended to have annual flu vaccination, because in adults 50 or 60 years and above, the influenza uh, does is indeed capable of causing complications that may even cause death, or certainly have a very pretty prolonged period of morbidity. So the flu vaccine is one of the commonest examples. Similarly, the pneumococcal vaccine, again, it causes pneumonia. Again, for adults 65 years of age or older, most countries, or many countries, would recommend a pneumococcal vaccine. Shingles, then, is another vaccine caused by herpes virus. Several countries recommend that uh, adults, elderly, the 50 years or 60 years or older, be given 2 doses of shingles. The thing about shingles, and or the difference between, say, a disease like shingles and pneumonia or an influenza, is that shingles doesn't really cause death. So the purposes may be somewhat distinct. But shingles causes an extremely painful and shingles is an extremely painful and debilitating condition.
Mm.
It doesn't cause death, but it really causes immense morbidity and suffering, particularly in the elderly. And therefore the shingles vaccine does have an important place in the basket of vaccines that may be considered for the elderly.
Yeah, and I found the COVID vaccination very very fascinating because for the longest time, the creation of vaccines and the administering of those vaccines takes decades, even just developing and administering it globally. And COVID itself has grown from a global pandemic and turned into an endemic just under 5 years, which is very very interesting looking at the speed of that, the creation of the vaccines. What do you think about that?
the the story of COVID vaccination is a story of speed, as you very rightly point out. Now, um, well, as luck would have it, or as a coincidence, the WHO had approved of now essentially why vaccines take a long time
Mm-hmm.
to get inducted into the system,
Yeah.
which is aside from the financial and logistics requirements. Setting those aside for a moment, vaccine trials, as you yourself said, and as we all know, takes years, if not decades, on the odd occasion. Now, in 2019, as luck would have it, the WHO had actually approved something called an adaptive design uh,
Mm.
to 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 test vaccines or to conduct vaccination trials in case of health emergencies and pandemics. It's that clause or opportunity uh, that was leveraged upon in the COVID vaccination trials, and in many situations for many vaccines, you would recall that even in the later phases of trial, emergency authorization was given to use this vaccine for the simple reason that that the risks from the disease were far higher than risks from vaccination. It is not that COVID vaccines have been without risks or without adverse effects. Uh,
Indeed.
there is still a whole body of research that's looking into what's happening post vaccination, and there are things that we are constantly learning. Also, with COVID vaccination, this whole system of monitoring adverse events following immunization, those have been strengthened, uh, including in India. It's grown by leaps and bounds. We were still uh, at a relatively early stage of maturity of this AEFI system, but the COVID really uh, has been a great game changer in that sense.
Indeed.
So the whole system had to be recalibrated, reinvented. This was really a domain of pediatricians because these adverse events were
Mm.
only monitored in children.
Mm.
But now with COVID coming in, we got adult physicians and specialists, the cardiologists, the neurologists, because the adverse events can and does affect a number of systems within the body. So, on the one hand, COVID vaccination had a very rapid uptake, subject to, of course, availability, costs, and so on. And different countries had different experiences. There have been, it's not necessarily been equitous in all countries or at all times. But COVID really has been a great learning experience, and more importantly, it's strengthened elements of systems such as adverse event monitoring, uh, and these would be permanent lessons or permanent benefits.
Indeed, indeed. And throughout COVID, I can see that it has created a massive global health, the change within the global health conduct and the differences, how it made, because as you mentioned previously, there was testing that has been done for years and it takes a very long time for certain vaccines to go out. So during a pandemic like this, actually, it's very important. And I also took note of the post vaccine researches because, as we know, a lot of the issues with the COVID vaccine is some people can get loss of sense of smell. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and there have been reported very serious adverse events, deaths, and then some age
mm-mm.
groups are more prone to complications and so on and so forth. So typically, while a vaccine has goes through three phases of trial, gradually escalating and elevating the number of samples, etc. There's a phase four, which is called the post-marketing surveillance,
Mm.
or a phase four, where you actually go on continuing monitoring individuals or cohorts who have received a certain vaccine, and that's being done pretty rigorously for COVID vaccines in many or almost all countries of the world.
Mm, that's really wonderful. And as we're talking about the global health impact, right? How do vaccines help prevent long-term health complications from infectious diseases besides COVID, for example, like HPV, measles, and polio?
So we are now in the what's known as the immunization
Mm-hmm.
agenda 2030, which is in
Mm,
sync with the with the sustainable development goals.
yes.
So so within the immunization agenda 2030, uh, adult vaccination certainly has a very important role, and there are two uh, overlapping targets or aspirations. One is the decade of healthy aging in 2020, and the other is the immunization agenda 2030. So, as far as immunization agenda goes, in 2025, as we speak, we are really in the midpoint of this journey or goal. And what happens in the next 5 years is going to have a significant bearing on how much gains immunization agenda 2030 actually accrues, and therefore in sync with the larger
Mm-hmm.
SDGs. So within this immunization agenda 2030, vaccination for the elderly also has a pretty important place and role. And to that extent, there's an overlap of the multiple global health agenda, and that's really a positive thing, uh, because by the long term understanding is that by 2050, which is
Mm-hmm.
another 25 years, about 20% of the global population, which is, as you can understand, immense in absolute terms, which is one fifth of the global population, will be aged more than 60 years. And
Mm.
that's something, that's a long term vision, and the milestone that we need to keep in mind as we design and calibrate things at this point. So within the immunization agenda, it's not just for increasing or sustaining vaccination in children, but also that we keep adults and elderly in mind, in the radar, and therefore the 2025 immunization week slogan that we have in April each year by the
Mm-hmm.
WHO and the other supporting UN and related bodies is that in 2025, let's show the world that immunization of all is humanly possible. It's often thought of as a tremendous task, which it is, but what WHO has been emphasizing is that it is indeed humanly possible, and it is in that spirit that we understand both immunization agenda as well as the decade of the elderly, and find synergy between these two goals.
Yeah, that is very important as we are becoming more and more of an aging population as we move further in the future. And I have a question that maybe a lot of our listeners as well have this in mind. Can vaccines play a role in preventing non-communicable diseases such as cancer or autoimmune disorders? Are there any researches in these topics?
Yes, of course. Now, one of the commonest cancers, particularly in some parts of the world, including in India, for example, uh, is the cervical cancer among women. It's the breast cancer and cancer cervix is two of the commonest cancers among women. So again, I would emphasize that vaccines is one of the tools for prevention, not the only tool, and shouldn't really be seen as larger than life. But the vaccine against the human papilloma virus, or HPV, is a
Mm.
very significant tool for preventing. I mean, administered in adolescent girls is a very important tool for preventing the human papilloma virus. Similarly, say the vaccines again, and of course, all of these vaccines are not necessarily available right now. The human papillomavirus is. India is committed to inducting it into the national immunization program, but there may be other vaccines such as say the Helicobacter pylori vaccine, which may have a
Mm,
significant role in preventing stomach cancers in parts of the world where gastrointestinal cancers are pretty high. So there are often communicable causes to non-communicable diseases, and that's where vaccines may and indeed do have a role.
mm, I see. And I'd like to talk about HIV because, as we know, HIV still so far has no cure to it. And is there any vaccinations to prevent HIV/AIDS?
The quest for an HIV vaccine has been a very interesting story,
Mm,
and very interestingly, I mean, quite as we speak, in South Africa, one of the HIV vaccines, or one of the potential HIV vaccines rather, has been under testing. It has shown encouraging results in animal models, but the reason why
mm,
it made news in the last few days is not because it shows interesting results, but because the funding to it from the USAID has been suspended, or at least temporarily suspended. And therefore, much of the HIV candidate vaccines are being developed in the African continent, uh, and global funding, including US funding, has been a very significant support for that. So while on the one hand, we 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 are on the journey to hopefully have an effective HIV vaccine, but the global financing uh, ecosystem also has to be able to support that, and that's where some of the recent disruptions seem to have been.
that's a new information to me. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rajib. And why is it important to adopt a life course approach to vaccination, including booster doses for adults and for the aging population, for the elderly?
Um, what really has changed, let's in the last few decades, is mortality or deaths from infectious causes, and a higher proportion of deaths are from non-communicable diseases, including, I mean, all sorts of chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, kidney diseases, and certainly trauma and injuries. But that doesn't really mean that uh, infections are really gone, or that they're things of the past. What's reasonably things of the past is mortality among the young on account of infectious diseases. Therefore, but however, infections in the elderly can certainly lead to earlier deaths or cutting the life short.
Mm,
And that's where vaccines have or may play a role. But many of these vaccines, such as the influenza vaccine, require annual vaccinations. Pneumococcal vaccines require annual vaccination, and therefore the mechanisms, and as the numbers of elderly grow in both in terms of percentages as well as in terms of in absolute numbers, and as what's known as the dependency ratio grows, which means that relatively younger people are supporting or providing for a relatively larger number of elderly people. So the way we will see financing or governmental support or programmatic support for elderly vaccines is going to determine a lot on how much or to what extent vaccines can play a role in giving the elderly a relatively infection free, or at least free of serious infections and
Mm.
accelerating deaths in case you get such infections. The other
Mm.
important emerging role of vaccines, and that too in the elderly, but also in the young, is the ability of the vaccines to reduce antimicrobial usage and antimicrobial resistance, which is a very, very large
Ah,
emerging problem, as we know.
indeed.
So, by some projections, within a couple of decades, AMR can kill as many as cancer is killing today. So it's though per se infections, we may seem to have a handle on infections, but with increasing antimicrobial resistance, we are going to lose some of that advantage or some of that weaponry, and therefore vaccines are being seen in a, if I may, in a new light, uh, as being instrumental to lower antimicrobial usage, and certainly to prevent or delay or reduce antimicrobial resistance. And the elderly, I mean, it's common knowledge that on an average the elderly actually fall sick a lot more than young healthy
Yeah.
adults. So at extremes of age, which is young children and the elderly, we have a lot more infections, and therefore a lot more usage of need and usage of drugs and antimicrobials. And that's where the elderly vaccines, again subject to availability, etc., are a very promising uh, tool to limit and reduce antimicrobial usage and resistance.
I actually have heard more of antibiotic resistance. So is there a correlation between antibiotic resistance and antimicrobial resistance or ability
The
to resist
antimicrobial,
those?
all antimicrobials are not antibiotics. It's a
Mm.
finer point. So the generic
Mm.
term is antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial usage. So all
Mm.
antimicrobials are not antibiotics. So that's the limited point.
Okay, so there's a difference in this. Thank you for clarifying. And how can immunization programs actually
But
improve the
for all practical purposes, they can be used interchangeably
I see.
in
So
common
but there
discourse, at
is a
least, let's say.
difference. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. And how can immunization improve the health span of the elderly in general? Because we have touched base on how we can utilize these five vaccines in the future, but how can it actually change the health span of the aging population?
Right. Now, for example, influenza is an extremely common illness, particularly in temperate zones of the world.
Indeed.
So is pneumonia,
Mm.
and with each influenza episode in an elderly, and it obviously doesn't affect only the elderly, but his or her family or community and so on. So
Mm-hmm.
this means that uh, it disrupts the daily lives, and and certainly in some cases livelihoods of not just the elderly or the caregivers and so on, because the particularly the very elderly would certainly need uh, support at home or institutions. Also, in countries or in contexts where the proportion of the elderly living in institutions is pretty high, these infections also spread very rapidly through institutions. We have, if you remember, some of the very earliest COVID deaths, particularly in some of the European countries, in the
Mm-hmm.
USA, were among the elderly living in nursing home settings,
Mm.
where the elderly are where each elderly is in contact with another with a fair number of elderlies, and all of whom are more vulnerable or as
Yes.
vulnerable, and therefore managing these infections within these institutions is an immense challenge should there be an infection. So vaccines in such settings have actually a much stronger role, uh, than maybe an elderly staying within a family setting or within a community setting. So
See.
uh, the purpose, again, to go back to your question, is to be able to ensure, and that is a larger moral and societal goal, to ensure as healthy a life as possible for the elderly and for everyone indeed within each one's lifespans. And that's how we prolong the health span and we make it healthy and enjoyable for an elderly.
Indeed, that's quite important for the elderly, as you mentioned. It's quite similar to taking care of young infants and children who get infected by each other a lot in a class. So yeah. And I think we talked a little bit on COVID-19 and how it has shaped the global response into a speedy response in terms of taking care of pandemic as it was contained within 3 to 4 years or so. And what does this teach us about managing future pandemics?
Well, on a more optimistic note, I think as a world we have matured a lot to handle pandemics. Uh, to that extent, HIV is also a pandemic, and the response to HIV has been very uneven across many parts of the world. But that's also because it's stigmatizing. It's socially quite a different disease than say COVID. Uh, the COVID deaths, though they are far more in the elderly, but young adults have also certainly are counted within these mortality figures. But COVID mortality significantly has been among older persons and the elderly. But in terms of a well-rounded response to a pandemic, uh, all of us believe that the world and individual countries are a lot stronger. But that again doesn't mean that all countries or all societies have been able to be as equitous. And while in terms of technology, in terms of programs, we are perhaps a lot stronger or relatively more confident, but
Hmm.
equity challenges still remain. And the COVID vaccine, for example, has been pretty inequitous in many countries. In
Mm.
countries with pretty, see, India and Indonesia are exceptions in the sense that both these countries, while both these countries have very large populations, both
Yeah.
these countries also have very significant vaccine production capacities and are
Yes.
not really that dependent on vaccine imports or global markets or, or global financing mechanisms and so on. But these are more exceptions than the rule for much of the LMIC world. To that extent, India and Indonesia are very notable and fortunate exceptions. So, a future pandemic response, therefore, learning lessons from the current one, uh, should hopefully be far more equitous than this one.
As we're talking about the future of vaccines and managing future pandemics, I'd like to know the future of vaccinations and the society at large. And how might advancements in vaccine technology, such as mRNA, adjuvants, influence approaches to disease prevention in the future?
Okay, these are very important questions, and there are several somewhat distinct dimensions. uh, let's talk of vaccines first, and then we'll talk of vaccination. And it's an
Yeah.
important distinction to make that vaccines don't save lives; vaccinations do. So
Ah,
that's a very important thing to keep in mind. But let's talk about vaccines first, and then we'll come to vaccinations. So uh, again, as far as the elderly populations go, uh, there's a phenomenon called immunosenescence, which simply means that your immune
mm,
system isn't as robust in terms of immunological memory, just like
mm,
the routine memory, weakens. So the immunological memory also weakens. So, quite a bit of the research is around understanding the phenomena of immunosenescence and therefore what kind of modifications vaccines in the elderly need, because the same vaccine which evokes a certain amount of immune response in a younger adult or in a child may not or need not, in fact, invoke the same degree of immune response in the elderly or somebody who is of a very advanced age, say age 80, 90 and above. So the immune response certainly varies with age, and therefore, with increasing understanding of immunosenescence, adjuvants are increasingly coming into play, and that's what
Mm.
makes vaccines, to put somewhat crudely, stronger
Mm.
and more effective in the adults. Also, newer platforms such as mRNA, etc., have, in a sense, completely revolutionized vaccine development, and vaccine development is increasingly going to be shorter. And to make
Mm.
this journey from vaccines to vaccinations, uh, traditionally and almost as a rule, and certainly in popular imagery, vaccines means injections and needles, and that's certainly pretty frightening to young, I mean, to the children,
Mhm.
and it certainly can be frightening or debilitating. And with it, with the needle comes a set of what we call minor adverse reactions, such as pain, probably a bit of fever,
Mm.
sometimes injection abscesses, and so on. So there is
Yes.
also an effort to to think beyond needles, and
Mm.
increasingly other routes are being tried. So in COVID, for example, we have seen nasal vaccines being developed and actually being in operation. Uh, then there are pretty innovative vaccines such as sublingual vaccines for rotavirus. There's something called melt in mouth strips for children, and
Oh.
the other trajectory in which vaccination is moving. But of course, many of these technologies may not be applicable to all vaccines. uh, Increasingly we are moving into what's known as microneedles, when you actually do not use conventional needles. uh, there are there's a technology called nano patch, which you apply on the skin,
Mm.
and
Yes.
and and from the conventional needles, uh, there's a there's a there's a stream of technology that's moving to using laser technologies, which will make injection virtually painless. And that's one of the ways of expanding immunization coverage, particularly with injectable vaccines, is to be able to make it painless. And the laser based technologies are an important step towards that. And then there are various models of microneedles being developed. One of or Some of these have been used in COVID vaccination. Also, some of these newer technologies are amenable to 3D printing, and therefore one need not necessarily need a very large or very intensive industrial setup. The other important purpose or goal for developing some of these technologies, and that's very crucial to countries or contexts such as ours, LMICs, and even middle income countries, is that these are increasingly reducing the quantity of vaccine that you would need uh, to to evoke a similar immune response. Most vaccines by needle, administered through injections, are given intramuscularly, which means you inject the vaccine into the muscles and it's gradually taken out from there. In
Mhm.
contrast, in all, as a general rule, intradermal vaccines, which means where you deposit the vaccine into the skin layer,
Mm.
into the dermis actually requires a lower quantity of vaccines. So,
Mm,
for example, in many countries of Asia and Africa, uh, we have moved from the conventional intramuscular vaccine for rabies to an intradermal route, which has cut down the requirement to a fifth, up to a fifth. So some of these newer technologies, such as the hybrid microneedle, what's called the hybrid microneedle array, or a hybrid mNA, has the promise of cutting down the dose up to 100th, because these are capable of delivering extremely small doses which you can't really measure through the naked eye the way we draw an injection from a vial in a conventional vaccination session. So, on the one hand, newer vaccines, newer platforms are coming into play. And on the other hand, newer technologies for administering the vaccines are coming into play. And uh, and then the purpose is really to have a win-win combination of these two arms or two pillars, so that newer vaccines can be inducted faster than it was earlier, and the fact that the methods of administration are painless or nearly painless and requiring increasingly lesser quantities means that in real life deployment could actually become far more affordable and accessible than
mm.
we understand or think or know in conventional terms. All of that could change and is certainly changing. How rapidly, it may be a bit difficult to forecast, but it's certainly changing, or it's on certainly a path to change.
Yeah, it's quite an insightful piece of information that I've never heard of, especially the different ways of vaccines that can be administered through melt in mouths and through the dermis. Because from what we know and what we understand is that vaccination is painful and it uses needles, and that the future of vaccinations seems quite fascinating. And it's I cannot wait to see what is going to happen in the near future. And in what way one last question is, in what way could new vaccines help address emerging threats like antibiotic resistant bacteria or novel viruses?
As far as viral diseases go, there will always be a quest for vaccines, because developing antivirals is far more difficult and far more elusive
Mm-hmm.
than developing antibiotics. On the other hand, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, the
Yeah.
antibiotics are facing, if I may, an existential threat from antimicrobial resistance. And antimicrobial resistance, what we need to appreciate is that it actually uh, spreads through the environment too, and the environmental dimensions of antimicrobial resistance. Uh, much of the world and the LMIC context has not really been very effective in getting a handle on the environmental dimensions of AMR. So the while AMR has been in its earliest form in discourse for 40 plus years now, by mid 1980s, antimicrobial resistance has been a matter of pretty serious discussion. Yet it's now gaining a lot of visibility and a lot of support from governments, uh, more so post COVID, and with the recognition of the One Health doctrine. Yet the antimicrobial resistance, sorry, I mean measures to address AMR are still going to be. It's going to be a pretty slow and uphill struggle, let's say. An antibiotic usage, antimicrobial usage is on the rise and rise, actually, if one looks at
Mm,
consumption data in many countries. What's been also, what we often don't know and don't recognize is that any country that has really industrial scale production of animal food or animal source food of any kind, whether it's poultry, whether it's piggeries, whether it's beef, any industrial scale animal food production actually is a huge consumer of antibiotics,
Mm.
unless or till the point that the industry really cuts this down. So in a couple of decades back, in some of the European countries, which has industrial scale beef production, some of the antibiotics which are used in the beef industry or beef production industry, the consumption for some of these relatively smaller countries, the consumption of some of these antibiotics were even up to 10 times the consumption among humans. Till in the late 90s and early 2000s, all of these countries, I mean, gradually they moved on to an antibiotic free regime for animal food production. But that's still not true for much of the developing world or the LMIC contexts. A still immense amount of antibiotics are being used in the poultry industry or the bigger industry, depending on which country you are in. So India has now taken this move to not have any antibiotics in animal food production from 1st of April 2025. It is a
Ah.
policy decision. It may be difficult to implement, but it's a very important beginning. And quite a bit of antimicrobial resistance therefore works back to the way animal food is produced, also the way the pharma industry is releasing or not releasing some of these residues into water in farmer in farmer production industrial areas. So AMR is a lot more complex, or managing AMR is a lot more complex than actually popping less antibiotics. It's an immense multisectoral challenge, but it's something that on which there is broad agreement, and all governments are certainly trying to do and improve things.
I see. Because a lot of people think, in regards to antibiotic resistant bacteria, it's because they go to the doctors too often and they receive antibiotics. Is that also part of the problem, or should we take more of at home remedies to reduce the existence of antibiotic resistant bacteria in our bodies?
No, yeah, that's a very important point. The WHO now does certainly recognize at-home remedies, and all societies
Mm.
do have traditional remedies. Any pharmacology textbook will tell you that anything between 50 to 60% of diseases actually get well on their own, provided we are
Mm.
patient enough. Yes, there is both overprescribing, and in weak
Yeah.
regulatory environments, you can simply buy antibiotics over the counter. And I again emphasize, uh, it's a lot more overusage in the animal sector. But that's also because we have to appreciate that to a farmer, losing his or her livestock is an absolute disaster. It's not just being a bit unwell for a few days, but it's where the livelihood is linked. So so in the vet, so it's extremely important to strengthen veterinary public health as much as the human public health, to cut down on overall antimicrobial usage, and therefore in the veterinary sector, vaccines actually play an immense role in reducing infections. Yet there are a number of common infections for which for which the consumption of antibiotics can be pretty high.
I see. So antibiotic resistant bacteria can actually be coming from the food that we eat, from the meat that
Yeah,
we eat.
and also because the AMR genes are transmitted. It's not that you need
Ah,
to take antibiotics. The AMR genes are also transmitted, and that's a far more complex problem.
I see. So I didn't really think of it that way before this conversation, and I found that very mind opening. And okay, so the next question would be the practices and habits that we can do, since we have talked in length in vaccinations, the future of vaccinations, and how vaccinations actually take place. So, what is a practice that you can do to prevent yourself from falling sick after vaccinations?
If you ask about falling sick after vaccinations, many vaccines will produce mild fever
Mm,
or some or minimal symptoms, but on the odd occasion, despite very extensive and cautious trials,
mhm,
vaccines may produce some serious adverse events. Also, there may be what we call coincidental events. There may be an underlying disease, and coincidentally, after a vaccination, one may have a heart attack or some other major illness. But these are not necessarily causally linked to the vaccine. Many a times these are coincidental. So when these adverse events are reported, the purpose of the investigation is to figure out whether it is because of the vaccine or it is because of any other underlying condition and therefore coincidental. But this does not mean that uh, we are not alive to the possibility that some very rare event is happening and it's not necessarily coincidental. It should be misconstrued that any adverse effect is denied. That there's a sense of denial that is because of the vaccines. So there is a very cautious approach to monitoring and learning from adverse events after any immunization. There's a whole uh, global doctrine of patient safety, and vaccine safety is part of the patient safety understanding and patient safety imperatives. And therefore, each country has its way of monitoring, tracking adverse events following a vaccination. This is something which is relatively new.
mm,
Uh, all many countries are learning and streamlining and strengthening mechanisms. Even within a country as large as India, states or districts may vary in their maturity to have this adverse events monitoring system. But it's something all countries and all health administrations are pretty serious about. And as elderly vaccination increases, but monitoring, tracking, these are also multidisciplinary efforts and a multidisciplinary task. So as adult and elderly vaccination is increasing, the way the adverse event system was traditionally, and by traditional I don't mean beyond a couple of decades, but the way it's been traditionally organized is now very rapidly changing, because the nature of adverse events in children and in elderly are quite distinct. You need different clinical specialists to understand that, to unpack that, and to come to a final diagnosis. But
mm,
all health administrations, all immunization programs are alive to the risks, and certainly very cognizant of tracking these.
mm. I see. So that would be the answer for the society at large. But for the individuals, the individual recipients at home who would like to recover faster from vaccinations, are there any practices that they can to do at home to
The
be in good
the
health
the
faster?
the standard advice is to be simply in touch with your health provider,
Mm,
whoever is administering the vaccine, or the clinic or the health center from wherever you're getting your vaccine. Uh, each of Many of these vaccines may have a few specific do's and don'ts in the days immediately after the vaccination, and therefore being in touch with your provider and getting back to him or her should you get any symptoms is really what's advised and what's necessary.
thank you very much for telling us what practices we can do at home. And that is it for the questions that I have for you today, Rajib. And now it's time for the open mic session where you have the chance to talk about anything that you are passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the stage is yours, Rajib.
Well, like it or not, it is a little link to the topic.
That's all right.
uh, because and particularly in societies such as ours, we strongly believe that health equity still remains a challenge, whether it's in terms of accessing medical care, whether it's in terms of accessing very simple life-saving technologies as vaccines. And therefore, we look forward to a more equitous world where each individual has more or less the same probability of reaching one's life expectancy and the health span in being able to lead a healthy life.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing. It was really an insightful talk about vaccines and the well being of ourselves. And if our listeners want to know more about you and what you do, where should they go?
Well, I do not have any social media account. So
Including
maybe
LinkedIn?
that's what maybe that's what I should have said in your previous answer to a previous question about myself.
I see.
So
So
it's
LinkedIn
a bit of a
or anything?
it's a actually the answer is no. It's a bit of a paradox, though I have very sustained media engagements. I simply do not have any social media account.
I
So
see.
so personally, I
Or
do not have
mhm.
anything to offer, so to speak.
Okay, maybe you want to share your books or journals that you want to share to the world?
Well, I, 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 I like to respond to every opportunity or every challenge that I get, and I'm happy to work, if I may, in a relatively quieter manner.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And that is it for today's episode. We'll catch you in the next episode. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Very happy to have this conversation.
You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.